She never thought her life would end up like this. Sitting on the cold floor of an empty room, the darkness around her reflected exactly what she felt inside. A complete blackout of the soul. It wasn't just sadness, it was something deeper. Silence. Like the whole world had forgotten she existed. Friends? Gone. Family? Distant. And God? She wasn't even sure he was listening anymore. She had prayed, begged, pleaded, but the heavens stayed silent, like he had turned his face away. And in that broken, invisible state, she whispered one final line into the void. "If you still care, show me. But it has to be now." Maybe you felt that too. If this story already stirred something inside you, hit like and subscribe, because what happens next will change everything. She had cried so many times before, but that night, nothing. Not a single tear came out. Her eyes burned, her chest ached, but she was too numb to weep. It was as if her body had finally given up trying to grieve. There was no more fight in her, no more strength to even fall apart. She stared at the ceiling, blank, motionless, listening to the hum of silence in the room. No noise, no phone buzzing, no one knocking, just the echo of her own heartbeat, reminding her she was still alive, even if she didn't want to be. That night, something inside her shut down completely. She didn't scream. She didn't pray. She just existed. Barely. And somewhere between midnight and morning, she made a quiet decision. Tomorrow I won't wake up in this pain again. She didn't know it yet, but heaven had already moved. The answer she thought would never come was already on its way. It started as a whisper. At first, she thought it was just her own tired thoughts. But the more she listened, the louder it grew. "You'll never make it. You're not strong enough. Even God gave up on you." These weren't just passing doubts. They were sharp, cruel lies, dressed as truth. And they came not from her heart, but from something darker. Fear had a voice. And that night, it spoke without mercy. It reminded her of every mistake, every failure, every person who had walked away. It replayed her worst moments like a movie, one she couldn't turn off. And the worst part? She started to believe it. Because when you're in the dark long enough, even lies start to sound like the only voice that's real. But what she couldn't see is that a second voice was coming, one she didn't expect. And when it finally spoke, it silenced the fear for good. As she lay there in the silence, the past came flooding in, not like a soft breeze, but like a storm she couldn't outrun. She remembered birthdays that no one celebrated, phone calls that never came, the way her father used to avoid looking her in the eyes, the day her best friend stopped answering messages, the night she stared at herself in the mirror and whispered, "What happened to me?" She hadn't always been this way. There was a time she laughed without fear, a time she believed she had a future, a time she dreamed, but somewhere along the way, piece by piece, life broke her, not in one big tragedy, but through 1,000 tiny cuts, rejections, disappointments. People who said they cared, but disappeared when it got hard. Now all she had were fragments, memories of who she used to be, and no idea how to become that person again. But what she didn't know is that God doesn't rebuild from the outside in. He starts with the shattered parts, the pieces no one else would even try to fix. And right there, in the middle of all that brokenness, a shift was already happening. Every day looked the same. Wake up, survive, go to sleep, repeat. She wasn't really living. She was just existing. Going through the motions with no fire in her soul. She'd make coffee and forget to drink it. Stare at her phone for hours, waiting for something, anything, to change. She'd scroll through pictures of strangers smiling, wondering how they found joy, and why it had vanished from her world. She'd walk the same streets, past the same faces, but feel like a ghost. Seen by no one, known by no one, loved by no one. And every night she'd return home and collapse into bed, whispering the same silent plea, "God, where are you?" But the silence stayed, or so she thought. Because sometimes, when God seems quiet, he's preparing something louder than words. She didn't know it yet. But the routine was about to break, not by force, but by divine interruption. Before the silence, before the numbness, there was trust. And it was placed in someone who promised to never leave. He said all the right things. Made her feel seen when no one else did. Promised forever, like it meant something. And she believed him. Because she wanted to believe. She needed someone to stay. But one day, with no warning, he walked out. No explanation. No goodbye. Just an empty space where love used to live. And the worst part? He didn't just take his things. He took her belief in people. That was the crack that started it all. After that, every relationship felt like a gamble. Every smile looked suspicious. Every "I care about you" came with a countdown. She stopped trusting, stopped opening up, and most painfully, she stopped trusting God. Because if God had really loved her, why would he let that be the beginning of her collapse? What she didn't know is that some things have to break so the truth can finally be rebuilt. And what was coming next wasn't betrayal, but restoration. She had prayed before, not once, not twice, hundreds of times, sometimes with tears streaming down her face, sometimes whispering through clenched teeth, sometimes without words at all, just her heart groaning in the quiet. But the silence, it never left. No voice from heaven, no miracle moment, no signs in the clouds, just stillness. And over time, that stillness began to feel like abandonment. Maybe he's busy with someone more important. Maybe I messed up too badly. Maybe he just isn't real. Those thoughts crept in. Poison disguised as logic. Doubt disguised as realism. And yet, somehow, she kept praying, even when it hurt, even when it felt pointless, even when the silence screamed louder than the words she spoke. Because deep down, beneath the pain and the confusion, something still burned. Something stubborn. Something holy. And that something was faith. The kind that doesn't depend on feelings. The kind that survives the silence. The kind that heaven honors. In its own time. It sat in the bottom drawer of her nightstand. Folded, worn, and unread. A letter she had written in a moment of raw, trembling emotion, but never had the courage to send. It wasn't addressed to a person, not exactly. It was written to God, not the polished prayers she grew up hearing. No Our Father, no Amen. Just truth, just pain, just her heart, poured out in ink. She wrote about the loneliness, the nights she felt invisible, the mornings she didn't want to wake up. She wrote, "If you see me, if you care at all, do something." Meeps, then she folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and left it there. Why? Because she was scared. Scared that if she gave it to someone, they'd laugh. Scared that if she left it in a church, it would be ignored. Scared that if God really read it, he might not answer. So she kept it hidden, forgot it. Almost. But that night, in the quiet, in the heaviness, she suddenly remembered it. And something in her whispered, "Go find it." She reached into the drawer, unfolded the letter. And as her eyes scanned the words she had once written in despair, she didn't feel abandoned. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. As she held the letter in her hands, a new wave came rushing in. Not sadness, not fear, but guilt. It wrapped around her like a chain, tight, heavy, unshakable. She thought about every moment she could have acted differently, every word she shouldn't have said, every time she turned away instead of holding on. Maybe this wasn't life falling apart. Maybe she had ruined everything. That voice returned, "It's your fault. You're the reason they left. God stopped listening because you stopped trying." And part of her believed it, because guilt doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers just enough to feel like truth. But here's the part no one told her. Guilt distorts. It rewrites the story in your head until you see yourself as the villain in every scene. Yet, deep in her soul, another thought tried to rise. What if it wasn't all your fault? What if you were just hurting? What if God isn't angry, but waiting? It wasn't loud, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, she let that thought stay a little longer. Because sometimes healing doesn't start with a miracle. It starts with a question. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't fall to her knees in some dramatic scene. Instead, it happened quietly, in a whisper, in a breath, in the deepest part of her soul. She sat on the edge of her bed, holding that old letter, and for the first time, she stopped fighting. Not with the world, not with people, with herself. She exhaled and said 3 simple words. I've had enough. Enough pretending she was okay. Enough blaming herself for everything. Enough carrying a burden that wasn't hers to hold. Enough waiting for someone to rescue her. And in that surrender, something unexpected happened. She didn't feel weaker. She didn't feel empty. She felt lighter. Because sometimes surrender isn't giving up. It's finally letting go. And in that moment, when she laid down her pride, her guilt, and her fear, something shifted. Not outside, inside. A stillness entered the room. But this time, it wasn't silence. It was presence. Warm, gentle, like a hand resting over her heart, saying, I'm here. She didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of everything. The next morning, she didn't plan to go anywhere. No destination, no schedule, no reason. Just a pull, subtle, almost unnoticeable, telling her, get out, just walk. So she did. She put on her shoes, grabbed her coat, and stepped outside for the first time in days. The sun wasn't shining, the air was cold, but somehow it felt better than being stuck inside her mind. She wandered aimlessly through streets she'd walked 100 times before, but this time, everything looked different. Not brighter, not softer, just realer. And then she saw it. An old wooden park bench, slightly crooked, half hidden beneath a willow tree. She didn't know why she sat down. She just did. And in that still moment, with the breeze brushing against her face, the sounds of the city distant but alive, something inside her opened. She wasn't crying. She wasn't praying. She was just present. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't running. And that's when it happened. A stranger sat beside her. No words, no smile, just a quiet presence. She didn't know it yet. But this would be the conversation that would rewrite everything. He didn't look remarkable, no glowing light, no voice from heaven. Just a man, middle-aged, worn coat, kind eyes. He sat down beside her like it was any other day, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. No small talk, no questions, just silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that weighs heavy. It was the kind that made space for breath. She didn't even look at him. She didn't need to. Something about his presence felt safe. And then, out of nowhere, in a tone so gentle it almost dissolved in the wind, he said just one sentence. God never forgot you. That was it. No follow-up, no explanation, just those 4 words. She froze, eyes wide, heartbeat crashing like waves inside her chest. How could he have known? How could a complete stranger speak the exact words she had been longing to hear for months? Years. She turned to face him, but he was already getting up, already walking away. No name, no goodbye, just a moment. But that moment, it shattered the silence. It pierced the darkness. It was the first time in so long she felt seen. The words echoed long after he walked away. God never forgot you. But what hit even deeper was what she felt after. It wasn't logic. It wasn't comfort. It was something else. A breaking. Not the kind of breaking that shatters, but the kind that opens up space for something new to enter. She sat there, staring at the place he had been, and her chest tightened. Not in panic, but in release. And that's when the second sentence rose inside her, from a place too deep to name. You're not alone. She didn't hear it with her ears. She didn't read it. It wasn't external. It was a whisper from the inside. A voice she hadn't heard in years. A voice she had almost forgotten. But it was hers. And somehow, it was his too. Tears welled up finally, after all those dry nights. But these tears weren't hopeless. They were sacred. They were healing. They were proof that something inside her was still alive, still listening. Because sometimes, the miracle isn't that the storm ends. It's that you realize you were never facing it alone. It happened slowly. So subtly, she almost missed it. The air around her felt different. Not colder, not warmer, just charged. Like the atmosphere had shifted. Like the very air she breathed was thicker with presence. She sat still, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever this was. Her heart wasn't racing, but it wasn't calm either. It was alert, as if something ancient and holy had just stepped into the moment. She looked around. Nothing had changed. The trees still swayed gently. The sky still hung over her like before. But inside, everything was different. She felt it in her chest, a pressure that didn't hurt, but felt too big for her body. She tried to explain it to herself. Was it relief? Was it the aftermath of emotion? No, it was something more. Something she hadn't felt in years. Something she used to read about, but had never fully understood. It was presence. Not of a person, not of the man who had spoken, but of God himself. He didn't shout. He didn't show up in fire or thunder. He just arrived. Quietly, powerfully, lovingly. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel empty anymore. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She barely even breathed, because the moment felt sacred. Not like being in church, not like reading a verse or listening to a song. This was different. This was real. It felt like someone was there, not in front of her, not behind, right beside her. She didn't see anything. No flash of light, no vision. But the presence was undeniable, as if someone had taken a seat next to her and simply stayed. It wasn't frightening. It was gentle, patient, kind. A stillness settled over her heart, but it wasn't silence anymore. It was communion, without words, without rules, just being known. She felt like every part of her, the broken, the bruised, the bitter, was being held by something she couldn't explain. And in that moment, a thought rose from deep within. I was never truly alone, not even once. Tears flowed freely now, but not from pain. They came from peace, because the presence she had searched for in temples, in people, even in herself, was here all along, right there, on that bench, in that breath. Suddenly, without warning, her mind began to rewind, like a film reel spinning backward. Images, moments, fragments of prayers she thought heaven had ignored. The night she begged for strength in the hospital hallway. The morning she whispered, "God, just give me one more reason to stay." The countless times she asked for comfort, for direction, for anything to let her know he was listening. Each scene played out in flashes, not just memories, but encounters. And now, she saw them differently. That stranger who gave her his umbrella on the day she almost collapsed in the rain, that wasn't random. The phone call from a distant cousin on the exact day she felt like disappearing, that wasn't coincidence. The song on the radio, the unexpected check in the mail, the hug from a child in the grocery store. They were all answers, just not the kind she expected. She realized something heartbreaking and beautiful. God had been responding all along, just not in the way she demanded. While she looked for fire from the sky, he had been speaking through people, silence, nature, and even her own breath. And suddenly, the tears weren't of regret. They were of awe, because he never stopped listening. Not once. He was just answering in his way. She closed her eyes, not to escape, but to lean in, because something inside her was shifting, unfolding, breaking open in the best possible way. And in that quiet space, between memory and breath, between surrender and presence, she saw it. A hand, not physical, not imagined, but real in the deepest way the soul recognizes. It wasn't the hand of the stranger, it wasn't her own. It was something greater, steady, strong, pure, radiant, holy. Not grabbing her, not pulling her, just waiting, open, offered. And in that instant, she understood. She wasn't being forced to rise. She was being invited, not to earn love, not to prove worth, but to receive what had always been hers: grace, presence, a second chance, not just at life, but at living with purpose. She reached out, not with her hand, but with her heart. And something met her halfway, something eternal. She stood up slowly, not because someone told her to, not because the pain was gone, but because something inside her had changed. The weight wasn't completely lifted, but it wasn't crushing her anymore. She looked around. Same bench, same path, same gray sky. But everything felt different, because she was different. With every step she took, it was as if the ground beneath her whispered, "You're not who you were when you sat down." Her steps were steady, but her heart felt tender, as if it had just been stitched back together, threaded not with logic or answers, but with something eternal: presence. The voices of fear didn't follow her this time. The questions weren't as loud. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't afraid of going home. Because home was no longer the place she dreaded. It was now the space inside her that had been filled again. She didn't know what tomorrow would hold. She didn't need to. All she knew was this: she left that park carrying peace. Not because life had changed, but because her soul had. That evening back in her room, she didn't expect anything. No signs, no wonders, no sudden fireworks from heaven. She just sat quietly, still, peaceful. And that was already a miracle. But then, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, half expecting another meaningless notification. But it wasn't. It was a name she hadn't seen in years, someone who had vanished from her life when she needed them most. Someone she had cried over, prayed for, and finally released. The message was short. "I don't know why, but you've been on my heart. I'm sorry for disappearing. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." She froze. Tears welled up. Not from sadness this time, but from the unmistakable realization. God heard. That prayer she whispered 5 years ago, the one she thought had dissolved into silence, this was the answer. Right here. Right now. Not just a message from a person, a whisper from heaven. She didn't need the whole story resolved. She didn't need explanations or apologies. This message wasn't about the past. It was proof of presence. Proof that she had never been forgotten. Not by people, and especially not by God. She didn't plan to pray. She didn't set the mood, light candles, or open a Bible. It just happened. One moment she was sitting there, holding her phone, heart trembling. And the next, she was on her knees, but this time, not in desperation, not begging for something, not asking God to fix her. She knelt because her soul knew He had been there all along. No words came at first, just tears, warm, healing, holy. Then a whisper left her lips. "Thank you." That was it. She didn't need to list her problems. She didn't need to justify her pain. She didn't even need to feel worthy. She just needed to be there, at his feet, in that moment, fully surrendered, fully loved. The floor beneath her felt like sacred ground, not because the room had changed, but because she had. For the first time, her knees weren't a sign of collapse. They were a sign of connection. And in that space, with the weight lifted and her heart wide open, she whispered again with quiet confidence, "You never left me." And heaven, though unseen, whispered back. In the days that followed, she didn't hear a voice from the clouds. No visions, no burning bushes, no dreams with divine instructions. What she received was people. Small, simple, perfectly placed people. The woman at the market who smiled and said, "You have a beautiful light about you." The elderly neighbor who knocked on her door just to say she had made too much soup. The stranger at the bus stop who looked at her and said, "You're going to be okay. I don't know why I'm saying this, but I feel like you need to hear it." And she did. Every time. These weren't accidents. They were answers. She began to realize God didn't always send fire from heaven. He sent humans, ordinary people with extraordinary timing, each one carrying a piece of what she needed: love, hope, affirmation, a reminder that she was seen. And slowly, the ache inside her chest began to soften. Because while she once cried, "God, where are you?" now she could see the truth. He had been showing up in people all along, not in thunder, but in kindness, not in miracles, but in moments. She didn't wake up one morning magically healed. The pain didn't vanish overnight. The scars didn't fade, but something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't trying to hide them anymore. For so long, she believed that healing meant erasing the mistakes, the memories, the parts of her that felt broken. But now she knew. Scars aren't shame. They're survival. Every scar told a story. A night she didn't give up. A prayer she whispered through tears. A battle no one saw. But God never missed. She began again, not by starting over, but by continuing on. With faith this time. The kind of faith that didn't demand answers. The kind that could sit with mystery. The kind that knew, even if I don't see it yet, God is moving. She walked into her new beginning not perfectly, but intentionally. She forgave people who never said sorry. She released dreams that had expired. She opened her hands so she could receive what was waiting. This wasn't the life she imagined. It was better. Because now she knew, even with scars, she was whole. Even through the darkness, she was guided. And even when she thought it was over, God was already writing the next chapter. It didn't come in one grand moment. No lightning in the sky, no voice echoing from above. It came in layers. A memory here, a person there, a quiet knowing that began to grow, like light slowly rising over a horizon she thought would stay dark forever. She started seeing patterns she hadn't noticed before. The way she had always found just enough strength to keep going, the perfect timing of that one conversation, the song that played when she most needed to hear it, the way her heart didn't completely close, even when she begged it to. And then it hit her. He had been there, every step, every tear, every breath, not absent, not punishing her, but patiently walking beside her through every moment she thought she was alone. He wasn't late. He wasn't silent. He was weaving. Every delay, every heartbreak, every unanswered prayer had been part of something bigger, a story only he could write. And she realized God hadn't forgotten her. He had been remembering her all along. Every detail, every cry, every dream she thought was dead. And now, with eyes wide open and a heart finally at peace, she whispered into the stillness, "I see you now." She still walks the same streets, still passes the same buildings, drinks the same coffee, hears the same city noise. But now, something is different. People notice it. In the way she carries herself, the softness in her voice, the strength behind her smile, There's a light in her eyes that wasn't there before, not a light born from perfect circumstances, but from survival, from grace, from knowing the difference between being broken and being reborn. She doesn't hide her story anymore. She shares it. Not because she wants attention, but because someone out there is where she once was. And if her story can become someone else's turning point, if her pain can become someone else's permission to hope again, then it was never wasted. When people ask her what changed, she doesn't give a long explanation. She just smiles gently and says, "I thought God had forgotten me, but now I know He never did." And that's enough. Because today, she doesn't just speak with words, she speaks with presence, with peace, with a quiet, radiant strength that only comes from walking through the fire and coming out with faith still burning. This story isn't just about her, it's about you. Because maybe, just maybe, you felt what she felt. The silence, the heaviness, the questions no one could answer. The ache of wondering if God had forgotten you too. And if you're reading this now, if something deep inside you has stirred, it's not an accident. It's an invitation. Not to fix everything overnight. Not to pretend the pain isn't real, but to take one small step toward hope, toward healing, toward Him. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to be perfect. You don't even have to feel ready. You just have to say, "God, if you're still there, show me." And He will. Maybe not in the way you expect. Maybe not with fireworks or thunder, but in quiet moments, in unexpected faces, in the kind of peace that doesn't make sense, but refuses to leave. Because the same God who never forgot her hasn't forgotten you either, and this moment right here might just be the one that changes everything.